Aloha, friends. I was digging around yesterday looking for some more depth on the Daily Wire story, as the recent development of co-CEO Jeremy Boering stepping down seemed to portend some future developments, shall we say. And I didn't really find much outside of the Ian Carroll gossip about the Daily Wire possibly going bankrupt. And there were a couple things about Carroll's video that seemed half-baked to me, so I tried to keep digging to see if anybody else had any interesting nuggets on it, and I didn't really find anything current. But I did happen upon a couple of older clips of Ben Shapiro along the way on the Iced Coffee Hour, where Shapiro discussed specifics about the financials and revenue sources of the Daily Wire that definitely, for me, added a new layer to the story. And I'll go over those with you and some other reporting from Axios late last year about the Daily Wire being open to being acquired, which that article from December of last year also had some nuggets about the financials. And I just kind of want to put this together because I think maybe other people are also trying to find out more in this information vacuum. So anyway, the Iced Coffee Hour clips are from September of 2023. So they're like 18 months old or somewhere in that neighborhood. But in one way, that's actually kind of convenient for our purposes because it predates the real choppy waters for the Daily Wire in the last year, because it's been just about exactly a year since they let go of Candace Owens and a few months since Brett Cooper was let go. So in some ways it might represent the apex of the Daily Wire's subscriber growth. And the other thing I just kind of want to mention is, I'm more than interested in other people adding their thoughts in the comments or other links, because I'm not really a follower of folks like Iced Coffee Hour or Ben Shapiro or, I don't know, financial YouTube stuff in general, especially people like the Iced Coffee Hour who were like shilling crypto stuff to their fans. That to me is like a real turnoff. So I'm missing some of the context for these clips. It was kind of like going into like a real ripe stew of douchebaggery in terms of the viewing experience for me. But I thought it was worth spending a few minutes of my time digging into this, and I'll try to excerpt the most relevant portions here. And in this first short clip from the Iced Coffee Hour, Shapiro, the whole conceit of this episode is Shapiro essentially stunting on everybody, telling him about how much money he makes. And Shapiro describes the revenue pie for their Daily Wire, breaking down where the money comes from. This is of a special note because Daily Wire is a privately held company, so they don't release financials like a public company would. So in this clip, Shapiro goes over in general terms where all the money comes from for the revenue for the Daily Wire.
Advertising earns us tens of millions of dollars. I'd say that represents maybe 25, 30% of our business. And then I would say that we have merch, and merch represents maybe another 5 to 10% of our business, and then the rest would be subscribers. Mm-hmm. And we have right now about 1 million subscribers on the website.
The gist there that Shapiro gave was that subscriptions make up the lion's share of the revenue for the Daily Wire, and that's something that I guess we probably could have guessed at, but the range Shapiro gives for subscription revenue at that point 18 months ago is like 60 to 70% of all of their proceeds. To me, that's super notable because their exposure to a subscription drop is going to be deadly for the company if they were to lose a significant amount of subscriptions. And it's also notable that at this point, back in September 2023, Shapiro said on the show that they had about 1 million subscriptions. And in the Axios article from December 2024, so just a few months ago, over a year later, which was headlined by Jeremy Boering saying that the Daily Wire was open to being acquired by somebody like Fox, the subscriber count that was given was said to be well over 1 million, which to me seems like the same general figure, same general area they were at over a year earlier based on Shapiro's comments on the Iced Coffee Hour. So it seems like the Daily Wire had plateaued in terms of their most important revenue source. And it's also worth pointing out that this was a few months ago, back before the real headwinds of bad PR had hit the Daily Wire. Interestingly, the Axios article was actually published on December 10th, 2024, which is the same exact day that Brett Cooper officially left the Daily Wire, if my Googling is correct. So I'm guessing that in the last 4 months or so, the subscriptions for the Daily Wire have not only become stagnant, but have probably taken a pretty big dip since Brett Cooper's exit and the company, and especially Jeremy Boring's continued unnecessary antagonism of departed stars like Cooper and Owens, and also some other stunts, things that they've done that have been controversial, like the whole pardon Derek Chauvin thing, which to me is just bizarre and sort of reeks of desperation because it's a non-starter. Anyway, and people have talked about this a lot, but it doesn't make sense, because if Trump pardoned Derek Chauvin, even not even taking up whether or not that's a good idea, it wouldn't release him for jail. He can't pardon him for a state case, so it's just bizarre. And yeah, it just seems like they're in a real weird spot in terms of trying to drum up any sort of interest and subscriber growth.
This is part of a campaign with their new website, pardonderek.com, which then leads you to the Daily Wire's website, where it has this note here which says, "We encourage you, President Trump, to pardon Officer Derek Chauvin. Sign the petition over here." And then the fine print right there you can read says, "By clicking here, you consent to receive emails featuring news and special offers from the Daily Wire and our sponsors."
The other things I mentioned is that the Daily Wire is a privately held company, so the financials are opaque. But based on these breadcrumbs, I think we can get a pretty good ballpark for where the company might be at, so we can better evaluate the rumors from Ian Carroll that the company might be in dire financial straits. One other short clip I wanted to add from the Iced Coffee Hour here is because it's just so ironic given the current situation the Daily Wire finds itself in, trying to censor or shout down voices on the right. Maybe not ironic, maybe the opposite of ironic, but anyway, it's just interesting given that slant to the story. And as I indicated, I'm not a fan of Shapiro. I wasn't really aware of his history. But in this Iced Coffee Hour clip from the same show, Shapiro says that he and Jeremy Boring's media company before the Daily Wire, which was, in Shapiro's words, like the prototype for the Daily Wire, was a company called Truth Revolt. And Shapiro describes the model for Truth Revolt as it was supposed to be like a conservative version of Media Matters. And Shapiro says this explicitly in the clip, but I just want to underline that Media Matters is a media watchdog that's known for organizing boycotts and going after sponsors of conservative media that they find objectionable. Media Matters is a left organization. So yeah, it's just interesting because I think I've heard a lot of people mentioning that they think that a big part of Ben Shapiro's brand is like free speech, and he must have rebranded over the years, because it seems like his origins in media are exactly the opposite. He was basically, in this clip, talks about how he wanted to create some sort of like mutually assured destruction with Media Matters. It's just bizarre logic. It just kind of blows my mind. But we'll play that real quick, and then we'll end up just doing a little bit of napkin math, trying to figure out where the company might be in terms of solvency.
And then I also launched a website with the David Horowitz Freedom Center that was called Truth Revolt. Truth Revolt was basically the predecessor to Daily Wire. It was designed as reverse Media Matters. So the basic idea was that the left likes to initiate boycotts against the right and get those shows canceled. And so we don't like that tactic, but the only way that people are going to back off that tactic is if that is mutually assured destruction, is if everybody understands the tactic is bad, so we're just going to avoid that tactic.
So just to put out a figure that we can have like a baseline for here, if the Daily Wire does have 1 million subscriptions, and if we assume that, I guess the standard paywall rate for the Daily Wire is around $15, it can be less if you pay yearly, but we'll sort of be generous here and go on the high side. So if we assume 1 million subscriptions at $15 a month, 12 months in a year, that's like $180 million in revenue. The Axios article from December of last year mentioned that there's a quote in there about, it's funny because this is basically like a sort of like almost like a deal deck. This article, it's basically like almost like an advertisement for somebody giving you like the thumbnail of like all the financials for this company, and it's based on their representations too. By the way, this isn't like a official financial document, so it's possible things could be fudged. But in the article, it says the Nashville-based company, which is on track to surpass $200 million in revenue this year, would come with a hefty price tag. So that's an interesting number, because if we take what Shapiro said earlier about subscriptions being like 60 to 70% of the revenue pie, that million subscriber figure sort of doesn't quite jive with $200 million in revenue this year, unless most of their subscribers are at something like the $12 level. But even then, it's there's just not a whole lot of wiggle room there. So I'm assuming at this point in late 2024, either the revenue pie distribution had changed to where subscriptions were like 90+% of the pie, or the subscription number must be lower. Yeah, and I'm not sure whether or not, I don't think they have a free tier. If we look on their subscription thing, yeah, it doesn't mention, maybe they have some kind of promotions. I don't know. It's just really odd. But even if we assume $12 a month for 1 million subscribers, that's like $144 million in revenue. And in the same article, they say they have well over 1 million subscribers. So yeah, there's just something about that doesn't quite fit. Maybe they're sort of being cute with the category of subscribers, including people that don't pay full freight or promotions. I don't know. There's just something kind of odd about that. And it leads me to believe that the indicator here is that the subscriptions are a bigger part of the pie than they used to be, because the other parts of the pie mentioned are like advertising and sales of merch, basically. And the article also mentions that they're something like $20 million in merch sales and Jeremy razors or something like that. So yeah, it just seems like a much smaller chunk of the pie, more like 10%, and then figuring what advertising is, who knows? Yeah, it just seems like the numbers are a little bit odd and indicate to me that if subscriber numbers have dipped significantly, like a 10% dip in subscribers would represent somewhere between like $14 and $18 million in revenue, which is like 10% or so of the entire yearly revenue. So it's generally equivalent. And I wouldn't be surprised if their subscriber counts drop by 25%. And if so, that you could see where they could get into a real catastrophic scenario, especially assuming the figures that Ian Carroll mentioned for the amount that the Pendragon cycle movies cost, like somewhere like $50 million, which seems like very conservative for a movie series. That not being released on time, you could see how that would really take a big chunk out of the balance sheet. I mean, that's like a quarter of their yearly revenue that's invested and held up in one property that's not going to pay off anytime soon. So I think it gives me like a little bit better perspective about what the gist here is and why the departures of Brett Cooper and Candace Owens could have been totally catastrophic, and especially considering how well each of those podcasts are doing in comparison to the holes that they left in the Daily Wire. Even if we assume like a small percentage of their audience moved over, that again definitely moves the needle. I don't want to spend like too much more time blathering on here about this, but the thing I kind of found odd about Ian Carroll stuff, and I don't really know him that well either. He seems like he's fairly new on the scene, but I do follow conspiracy stuff pretty closely, so he's more aligned to my general viewpoint, I would imagine, than Shapiro. But in his report, he initially said that Tim Pool was like in talks to acquire the Daily Wire, which to me just rang very discordantly. And I also noticed another YouTuber who I watch pretty frequently, Echoes from Above, also had that same reaction. It just didn't gel, didn't make sense at first blush. And so it's just kind of surprising to me that Ian Carroll didn't have that same reaction and like look a little bit more into that. And then later on, Ian Carroll corrected that part of the story, saying that his source had got it confused and that it was the other way around, that the Daily Wire was trying to acquire Tim Pool. Because it just didn't make sense to me, because Tim Pool is a much smaller media entity than the Daily Wire and probably doesn't have $1 billion in cash to acquire the company. Even if Carroll's source got that backwards, I mean, that's sort of a big part of doing reporting is sort of knowing the subject matter well enough to hear something like that and have some follow-up questions. And I, as somebody that's not nearly as plugged in as Ian Carroll, presumably thought that was odd just based on the facts as they're generally known. Anyway, I just also, one other note here is that if you haven't noticed, this channel's like kind of all over the place in terms of subjects, and my real area of interest has to do with I get super interested in these weird little niche groups or subjects, and generally like things with like extreme or outlier beliefs, hence the series on true crime weirdos or cult stuff. That's sort of my general purview, but I just want to mention this because I've done a couple of videos in a row now on conservative media stuff, and I can assure you I will wander off into some other area of interest. But it's just been interesting to follow this given the current political climate, and I try not to follow too much political stuff, but to me it's like almost more interesting to follow the mechanics on like the next level than the actual news stuff, how the companies are doing and what the media shakeups are. So I think enough people sort of share that same sort of interest pattern that it's worth discussing this on a more macro level. That's sort of where my interest lies. So yeah, I hope this was added some good context for you as well. And yeah, feel free to drop more links or more context if anybody's found any other good stuff in the comments. And yeah, appreciate your time and thanks for watching.